Thank you. Professor Amida said you would not be insulted if I took off my jacket. Right. So please don't be insulted. Thank you for that generous introduction. The problem with generous introductions like that is that the speaker seldom lives up to them, although I'll do my best. I'm interested, the talk I'm giving today is a synopsis of some parts of this book called The Art of Not Being Governed. The subtitle is An Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. So I'm talking about a huge area of northern Southeast Asia, above Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, including southwestern China, all the way over to India. It's a huge area, and my argument is that the people who live there in the hills are not people who never discovered civilization and Buddhism and wet rice cultivation. They are people who ran away from states for the last 1,500 to 2,000 years. And the best way to understand them is as refugees from early state making, not people who never discovered the joys and pleasures of living within states. And I want to begin with my hero, Pierre Clastres, who wrote a book called Society Against the State in 1950. And he was the first person, as near as I can tell, to suggest that people in South America who were considered by anthropologists to be Neolithic Stone Age people were in fact not Neolithic Stone Age people, but rather people who had given up sedentary cultivation because of their fear of forced labor in the Spanish settlements and the disease associated with the Spanish settlements. You'll recall that the New World population crashed by about 85% because of diseases brought by people from the Old World. And his argument was that the Yanomamo, the Siriono, the Guarani, and many other groups that were considered to be Stone Age survivals in the forest, like original primitive people, were not original primitive people, but people who had taken up foraging in order to be constantly on the move and to stay out of the way of states. And I'm going to quote the last two sentences of his book, which is the theme, essentially, for my talk today. He writes, quote, "It is said that the history of peoples who have a history is the history of class struggle. It might be said with at least as much truthfulness that the history of peoples without history is the history of their struggle against the state." He noticed, as I said, that people who were foragers were not always foragers, but had run away from state-making efforts by the Spanish. The same observation was made by a famous student of the relationship between the Mongols and the Chinese, Owen Lattimore, who was the first person to notice that the Great Walls of China were not so much built to keep the barbarians out as to keep the tax-paying cultivators in. That is to say, they were an effort to keep Chinese taxpayers from going over the frontier and evading their responsibilities to the state and the labor that they provided, conscription, taxes, and grain. By the way, there are a whole series of other walls that serve the same function. The Sumerians had a wall between the Tigris and Euphrates 6,000 years ago, a 170-mile wall, and it was meant to keep taxpayers in rather than to keep the barbarians out. It served both of those purposes. The area that I'm talking about in upland Southeast Asia, and it has many parallels elsewhere in the world that I'll mention in passing, has been called Zomia by a colleague of mine. I will not bore you with how we came up with the term Zomia, or he came up with the term Zomia, but it's a new name for virtually all these lands that are above 300 meters in altitude. all the way from the central highlands of Vietnam to northeastern India and going across parts of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma, 4 provinces of southwestern China, Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, and parts of Sichuan. It's an expanse of 2.5 million square kilometers, and it contains about 100 million people. That is to say, the size of a quite substantial nation state, although it is at the periphery of 6 or 7 nation states and at the center of none. So it's another way of, it's a kind of area studies with the invention of a new area, that is to say, this hilly zone that has no name until we chose to give it a name. So it represents a kind of novel object of study. It's a non-nation state history. My thesis is simple and suggestive, and I should say controversial. The argument is that Zomia is the last remaining region of the world where peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation states. Its days are numbered. But not so very long ago, the world was filled with self-governing peoples who were the great majority of humankind. Today, they're seen from the perspective of the Valley Kingdoms as our living ancestors, what we were like before we discovered wet rice cultivation, Buddhism, and civilization. I argue, on the contrary, that these people are best understood as fugitive runaways who have, over the course of 2 millennia, and it's important to see this as a long 2,000-year process, who have been fleeing the oppressions of state-making projects in the valleys: slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare. And there are many, although I'm dealing with Southeast Asia, there are many other areas of the world in which one can sort of document this accumulation of people in what I call non-state spaces. In Southeast Asia, it happens to be the mountains, but in other places it can be swamps and so on. So there are many different forms of non-state spaces, and it just happens that the Southeast Asian version is one of mountains. Virtually everything about these people's livelihoods, their social organizations, their ideologies, and more controversially even, which I'm not going into today, their oral traditions rather than written traditions, can be read as strategic choices designed to keep the state at arm's length. Their physical dispersion in rugged terrain, their mobility, their cropping practices, which I'll mention in particular, their kinship structure, their pliable ethnic identities, and their devotion to prophetic millenarian leaders are designed to avoid incorporation into states and to prevent states from springing up among them. The particular state that most of them have been running away from has been the precocious Han Chinese state. The history of this flight is embedded in lots and lots of hill legends. The documentary record, although it's somewhat speculative until 1400, is clear enough after that, including frequent military campaigns against hill peoples under the Ming and Qing dynasties, and culminating in the unprecedented uprisings in southwestern China in the mid-19th century that left millions and millions seeking refuge. The huge literature on state-making, contemporary and historical, pays virtually no attention to its opposite, that is to say, the history of deliberate reactive statelessness. So this is a history of those who got away, and I would argue that state-making can't be understood without it. The account that I am giving today could, if expanded, bring together the histories of all of those peoples extruded by coercive state-making and unfree labor systems: the Gypsies, the Cossacks, the Inuit, the polyglot tribes who ran away from the Spanish reducciones in the New World and the Philippines, fugitive slave communities, the marsh Arabs, the San Bushmen. One can identify in Africa, for example, even before the North Atlantic slave trade, a huge zone of an area of rugged terrain in which people fleeing from the Indian Ocean and Arab slave trade and later from the North Atlantic slave trade, they fled to an area that was more or less immune from slave raiding groups, that was safe. And this corridor represented a corridor of safety, and it had much more population than you would otherwise expect it to have. And the reason why people accumulated there is because it was the one area that was far enough away from slave raiding groups in order to provide a margin of relative safety. I want to make sure that I finish in 45 minutes, and I trust Professor Amida will wave his hand or throw something at me when I come up against a deadline. I argue that this is the last great enclosure of non-state peoples. If we take the broadest angle lens, Homo sapiens has been around for something like 200,000 years only. And 50,000 of those years only out of Africa. So it's a rather short history in kind of cosmic terms. And sedentary agriculture arises about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. That is to say, the last tenth of the time out of Africa and a very, very small fraction of the history of Homo sapiens. The small states of Southeast Asia arise about 3,000 years ago. The point being that for most of our species history, life was lived outside states, and in more recently in areas where states were just a small little speck on the globe, occupying only a small portion of the geographical space available. Sedentary agriculture is the necessary condition of state making. No sedentary agriculture, no states. It's possible to have sedentary agriculture without states, but it's very rare to have states without sedentary agriculture. It is the exception that proves the rule are those few states that happen to occupy a crucial place that are bottlenecks in trade routes. And there you have occasionally the growth of a state that dominates a crucial trade route that doesn't have, in a sense, a grain hinterland of its own of sedentary agriculture. But it's the exception that proves the rule. These states, as I mentioned, were a minuscule part of the globe. All of the areas outside the control of these early states were considered fiscally sterile. That is to say, the population outside these states was dispersed. They were mobile and nomadic. It was impossible to confiscate their goods because they had relatively few goods, and they were nomadic. There was no way, there were no resources, and the resources that these peoples had were almost impossible to access. And this area was therefore called, whether it was early Indian kingdoms, early Chinese kingdoms, or the Roman Empire, this was considered the barbarian periphery. The idea that where taxes and sovereignty stop, that's where the barbarians begin. It has nothing to do with the culture. It means that they're outside the state, that they don't come under the tax regime of the state. The relations between these early states and the barbarians were of two kinds. One of them was a relationship of trade, which was a relatively egalitarian relationship in which the barbarians occupied different ecological zones, and they were naturally trade partners with the lowland states. And therefore, they each had things that the other trade partner needed, but this was an exchange that was compatible with autonomy, both on the part of the people at the periphery and the people in the state. It was a relationship of fair and equal exchange from which either partner, especially the hill peoples and hinterland peoples, could withdraw if they so wished. The other relationship was the relationship of slavery. All of the early states, without exception, you'll remember that 80% of the population of the Greek city-states were slaves who didn't have citizenship rights. all the early states, without an exception, were slave states. And so the problem of providing a steady supply of slaves and controlling that population and controlling their labor and using their labor for the purposes of the state was the surpassing problem of statecraft. Most of the trade in Southeast Asia historically, the most important cargo were slaves. Most of the wars were wars not to conquer territory, but wars to conquer population, bring them back, make them settle under the walls of the state, as it were, and to grow grain which could be confiscated and to use their labor successfully. That is to say, there was this effort to take this population that was outside the state, to reconcentrate it, to sweep them in, control them, put them, make them state subjects in order to use their labor and to tax their grain. This was, in fact, the sort of great population movement in Southeast Asia for 4 or 5 centuries, the slave raiding and the effort to comb the periphery and collect as many slaves as possible. And of course, as in Africa, the slavery was, the hill peoples were themselves complicit in the slavery because one of their economic activities was to catch other hill people and sell them to the valley kingdoms. Now, the story that I'm telling is a story that doesn't make much sense after 1945. So I'm not going to apologize for that because I think it's pretty ambitious to do a story that covers 2,000 years up to 1945. But after 1945, 2 things change which make many of my generalizations not as plausible as they are. One of them is the ideology of the modern nation state projecting its physical power to the absolute borders, the physical borders of the nation state as they're established in the modern state system. Before, you had states that controlled a small portion of what would be the modern nation state. Only after the Second World War did you get the distance demolishing technologies of all-weather roads and trucks and tanks and later on helicopters and telegraph and telephone and so on that allowed the state to project its power, its sovereignty actually to the border and to approximate the theory of the modern nation state in which a nation governs its border 100% right up to the border, and then 1 inch over the border, it encounters an adjacent nation state and 100% sovereignty of that nation state. This never happened, and it becomes closer to reality after 1945. The second change is the degree to which this zone outside the state is fiscally sterile. That is to say, it turns out after 1945 and in advanced industrial societies that these backward peoples who are considered barbarians happen to be sitting on resources of enormous value for foreign exchange and for the fiscal health of the state. They're sitting on timber, they're sitting on valuable hydroelectric sites, they're sitting on the kind of precious minerals, the minerals that are necessary for the advanced aerospace industries and electronics industries. So all of a sudden, this area that was not interesting economically happens to be an area that it's important to control because it is an area of resources that are important for advanced capitalism and for the trade relations and foreign exchange of the modern nation state. I want to characterize the difference between the hills and the valleys in the following crude way. Let me say it once again to emphasize that in Southeast Asia, the non-state areas are in the hills by and large, and the state areas are in the river valleys. In other parts of the world, as for example in the Andean region, most of the alluvial agriculture is above 6,000 feet. So the states in the Andes happen to be at high altitude, and the barbarians are either further up the hill or they're down in the valley. So that the point about Southeast Asia is that all of the good alluvial land that makes it possible to have sedentary agriculture on a large scale happens to exist in river valleys. Where that alluvial land is at higher altitudes, you can have states that are, this is not geographical determinism, it depends where the alluvial soil is and where the agroeconomic conditions for state making exist. And the non-state spaces that I'm talking about, although they're mountains, in other places in the world, these non-state spaces might be swamps, for example, or marshes, places to which people can run away. Those of you who are familiar with the Marsh Arabs on the Iran-Iraq border, for 2,000 years, it was a zone to which people ran away to escape conscription and taxes and the law. To the periphery, to mountains, to deserts, and so on. It just so happens that mountains work in Southeast Asia, but you should be thinking non-state spaces and the kind of geography that abets escape from the state. In Southeast Asia, again, to put it crudely, the valleys are the location of states, of social hierarchy, of taxes, of kings and permanent clergies, of large-scale warfare, of self-described civilization, and above all, of wet rice agriculture. The hills, by contrast, are the location of what's called swidden cultivation, slash-and-burn cultivation, shifting cultivation, which I'll describe in more detail later. In the hills, by and large, there are no permanent states. Occasionally there are little petty states that arise, but they're episodic. They don't tend to outlast their founder or the founder's son. The population is dispersed. The social structure is relatively egalitarian. It's not perfectly egalitarian, but it's more egalitarian than the valley. It's a zone of tremendous cultural and linguistic variety. These areas are called, in other places, shatter zones. That is to say, areas where peoples have fled from many, many different cultural areas and linguistic zones and accumulated in a region of relative safety. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to sort of understand the incredible mosaic of languages and cultures and religious practices and cultural practices in these areas. Finally, the hills are places where there are no taxes paid to kings or to a permanent clergy. But here's the paradox. Most people in Southeast Asia think of hill people and valley people as essentially different kinds of people, different kinds of human beings, different species almost. And yet we know that people have been moving back and forth between the hills and the valleys for as long as we have any information at all. That is to say, hill people have been becoming valley people for as long as we know. That's the familiar story of people entering civilization, if you like. It's a story that many of the narratives tell themselves. But we also know that until the 20th century, it was just as common for people to leave the state zone and the valleys and become hill peoples over time. And that's a story that finds no echo in the narratives of the valley states because it represents something that contradicts its story. It's a kind of going over to the barbarian periphery of self-barbarianization. And yet we know that it was extremely common for people to move out of the zone of the state. Of course, if the state collapsed, you were out of the zone of the state by staying in the same place, as long as the state had completely collapsed. This distinction between valley and lowland state is one that has been noticed in many different cultural contexts, and I want to quote a few of them. Fernand Braudel, in the great book Mediterranean World, I think the second chapter is called The Mountains, and Braudel writes, and I want to quote him, not because I agree with him, but because it's a particularly outrageous version of this relationship. He writes, "The mountains are, as a rule, a world apart from civilization, which are an urban and lowland achievement. Their history, the history of the mountains, is to have none, to remain always on the fringes of the great waves of civilization, even the longest and most persistent, which may spread over great distances in the horizontal plane, but which are powerless to move vertically when faced with an obstacle of several hundred meters." The same argument is made for Southeast Asia, in which Paul Wheatley says that the Sanskritic tongues of the valleys were stilled to silence at 500 meters. His argument is that these languages never made it uphill. They were just lowland languages, and they never succeeded in moving up the watershed. This is the argument made. Ibn Khaldun made the argument that the Arabs could conquer peoples as long as the ground was flat, but when they were confronted by mountains or ravines or extensive deserts, they couldn't conquer these areas. Paul Moose, the great sort of writer on the history of Vietnam, said that Vietnamese civilization stopped at the foothills of the Annamite Cordillera because it confronted a physical obstacle that was also a cultural obstacle historically as well. The best expression of this in the Maghreb was by Ernest Gellner in his distinction between the Arab city-states and the Berber population that was outside the control of the states. And Gellner invented this term called marginal tribalism that I think is useful in this particular context, and I want to quote him. "Such tribesmen know the possibility of being incorporated in a more centralized state. Indeed, they may have deliberately rejected and violently resisted the alternative. The tribes of the High Atlas are of this kind. Until the advent of the modern state, they were dissident and self-consciously so. Marginal tribalism is the type of tribal society which exists on the edges of non-tribal society. It arises from the fact that the inconveniences of submission make it attractive to withdraw from political authority, and the balance of power and the nature of the mountainous or desert terrain make it feasible. Such tribalism is politically marginal. It knows what it rejects." My argument is not that civilizations can't climb hills, but it's rather that people climb hills in order to get out of the way of states. That these areas are what I would call regions of refuge. Thus, for the last 2,000 years, I argue, people have been moving into the hills in response to state-making projects in the valley, to taxes, to conscription, to dissent, including religious dissent. If you go into the hills of Burma and go from Buddhist abbey to Buddhist abbey, they represent a whole series of Buddhist sects that were kicked out of the lowlands that ran away to the hills and have preserved. It's like a historical museum of dissident valley sects that have recongregated in the hills. They're Buddhists, but they're not the kind of Buddhists that the people in the valley appreciate very much. People have also been moving because of famines and disease, which were much more common when you had concentrated populations in grain in the early states as well. And the way of understanding this long-scale, long-term movement is, for those of you who've been to carnivals and fairs, I like the image of bumper cars, right? And you have to think of this maniacal game of bumper cars over 2,000 years with people moving to the hills, bumping up against another group, the other group sort of moving perhaps or being absorbed, another impact and collision, another movement. So you get this fracture zones of a whole series of impacts and movements back and forth into the hills and away from the hills that create this extraordinarily complex and difficult mosaic to understand. The way to understand another example that may help you understand what I think has gone on in Southeast Asia is the history of the Cossacks. The Cossacks are probably the best known, most solidaristic ethnic group in Russia today. Of course, used by the Tsars as trained military units and much feared. But the Cossacks were nothing more and nothing less than runaway serfs from Europe, from Russian serfdom, from everywhere in Black Earth Russia. They fled to the periphery to get away from serfdom. If they went to the Don Basin, they became the Don Cossacks. If they went to the Azov Sea, they became the Azov Cossacks. And there they learned the horseback habits of the Tartars. They had open common property. Their whole subsistence changed, and they became an ethnic group at the frontier. They were nothing but runaway serfs from all over Russia, having no connection except being runaways. And at the periphery, they had this ethnogenesis in which they became the Cossacks. And there were eventually either 13 or 16, I forget which, Cossack hosts all over Russia that had a common identity, but it was an identity formed at the periphery. It did not pre-exist their movement to the periphery. And so I would argue that most of the groups that are thought of as tribes in the hills of Southeast Asia became tribes, became a people by a kind of self-making in the hills over a long period of time. I want to say something about the demography of the valley and the demography of the hills. The Thais have a proverb that goes, put vegetables in the basket, put people in the mong. Mong is the word for the kind of early small towns that were the core of states in Thailand. The argument is if you're going to form a small state, you have to concentrate people there, that is the key to statecraft. Let's imagine that you were a consultant, a kind of modern Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and it was your job to design an agrarian system that would be best suited for a traditional kingdom. What would you do? What kind of agriculture would you design? Your job would be to concentrate grain and people within a very small radius, and the grain roughly could not be more than a couple hundred kilometers maximum away from the center of the state. Why? Because a couple of oxen carrying a cart of grain, that's the technology of the time, will have eaten all the grain in the back of the cart by the time they've gone 150 or 180 kilometers. So you can't move grain economically over much more than 150 kilometers. So you'd want to concentrate grain and people in a very, they want to pack them in to a small central area. I believe you would want to invent something like wet rice cultivation. That is to say, there's nothing like wet rice for concentrating population. It's better than wheat. It's better than maize. It's the very best for state making because of paddy agriculture. What are the advantages of paddy rice? Here I will be saying things that will seem self-evident and stupid to you, but they will make sense a little later. The great thing about wet rice is, of course, it's a grain that grows above the ground. You knew that, I know. It all becomes ripe at the same time, more or less. So if the state wants your rice, it just has to wait till it's ripe, and it can come and take it all. Or if it doesn't like you, it can just burn your rice, and then you've got to leave. Or better yet, it waits till you've cut and threshed the rice and put it in your granary, and it takes everything in your granary. You then have to leave. So if you want to confiscate or destroy or drive out a population, if they're growing wet rice, your problems are much easier than they would otherwise be. Wet rice, if it's not husked, it stores quite well. It has high value per unit weight and volume and can be taken 200 kilometers roughly successfully. So it is, it capacity, its value, and the way in which it stores makes it a valuable state crop because it can be held as a tax, it can be distributed later, and so on. Thus, in Southeast Asia, where you have rice cores, you have the possibility of creating substantial states. Where the rice core is big, you might get a big state. Where the rice core is small, you might get a small state. The problem in Southeast Asia, of course, was very different from the problem in India and in China. In 1700, the population per square kilometer in Southeast Asia was 5 people per square kilometer. In India and China, it was between 30 and 37. So the point is that in Southeast Asia, you could not control people by controlling land. There was a huge frontier hinterland to which people could run away. You had to conquer this population and confine it in a way in which you could access their labor. Many people did and could run away from these states. The geography of state power depended on flat land and movement over water. That is to say, all of the Southeast Asian states depended on navigable waterways or coastlines in which they could move grain and products. This is unbelievably important. That is to say, I'll give you 2 examples that are, I think, in my mind, stunning examples. In 1800, before the steamship, it was faster to go by ship from Southampton, England to South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, than it was to go by stagecoach from London to Edinburgh. Think about that. I think it's actually not quite true, but it's very close to being true. And it's kind of, I read it in Tawny's book, and people have told me that it's not quite right. But even if it's close, it's an astounding statistic. And of course, you can take a lot more in a boat than you can take in a stagecoach as well. In 1954, to give you another example, the People's Liberation Army of China conquers Lhasa in Tibet. And the Tibetans are, as you could guess, not too happy about this, and they're not willing to hand over a lot of rice to the People's Liberation Army. So in Beijing, the new revolutionary government has to send rice to their troops in Lhasa. How do they do it? They don't do it overland. They send it in ships from Canton all the way through the states of Malacca to Calcutta, then by train up through what is now Bangladesh to Sikkim, and then 18,000 mules and horses and camels to take it into Lhasa. That is, they rely on the shipping from Canton all the way to Calcutta because it's the only way to move that rice. And so if the point is that our maps are completely misleading in terms of social contact and integration. That is to say, an area, a place that is 300 miles across easy water is, in every meaningful sense of the word, much closer than an area that is 20 or 30 miles across rugged mountainous terrain. That's why the Malay and Greek city-states were integrated across water by boat as a maritime empire rather than a land empire. So what we would need is friction of what I would call friction of distance maps, in which the unit would not be a kilometer or a mile, but the unit would be a day's travel. By foot, for example, it would give you, or by boat, and so on. And if you had those maps, you would vastly increase the size on the map of places that were difficult to travel through, like mountains and swamps and so on, and you would greatly shrink the size of areas that where travel was easy across water and across flat plains. But it would give you, it would look like a strange map that you would not be able to make sense of, but it would give you a much better grasp of actual social contact, exchange, integration, linguistic influence, trade, and so on. It would be a social map that would be far more powerful than just a geographical map. So all of the great states in Southeast Asia were located along the major navigable river courses, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, and the only exception that proves the rule in Southeast Asia is the Salween or New River, because it runs through a gorge and doesn't have the alluvial plains. So it's the one river system that doesn't have a whole series of states that are attached to it. So states stopped, if you like, at the mountains, at the marshes, and found it extremely difficult to extend their power effectively beyond these geographical barriers. I'm debating about, I tried in the book to figure out a graphic that would convey this and never succeeded, but I can kind of illustrate it. If you think about power in Southeast Asia, let's imagine, let me stand out here, let's imagine that I'm holding a piece of plywood that has a map of Southeast Asia on it, in which the relief of the mountains and so on is actually replicated in a papier-mâché relief of mountains, right? All according to scale. And let's imagine that every little state was represented by an inkwell filled to the brim with red ink. And let's imagine I'm holding that horizontally on a rigid piece of plywood. If I tilt this plywood a degree or two to the right, to the left, frontward, backward, the ink will flow out and flow over the flat areas of plain and water. That will give you a good indication of the areas into which the state was able to project its power relatively effectively, right? By just 1 degree, 2 degrees of this tilting. If I tilt it 5 or 6 degrees, right or left, forward or backward, the ink is going to start running into areas that are higher, that are more difficult to traverse. And the number of degrees that I have to tilt it to get the red ink to go into these areas gives you a rough approximation of the exertions that the state would have to make in order to project its power effectively in those areas. I don't know how this could be represented on 2 dimensions of space. The other thing to understand about the traditional Southeast Asian state is that it was a seasonal state. That is to say, once the monsoon began, nobody could go on the roads. It was just pure mud. And so the state shrank almost to the palace walls during the height of the wet season, and taxes and wars were conducted during the dry season. Even very recently in Burma, the Burmese wars against its minorities have been wars that are conducted usually in dry season offensives, and it's only helicopters and modern arms that have allowed an occasional wet season offensive to take place. So let me leave the valleys now briefly and go to the hills. And to characterize their agriculture. And let's imagine that a group of anarchist hill tribes had hired you to be a consultant to invent the kind of agriculture and social structure that would best insulate them from being controlled by states and by governments. I think you would fall in love with the root crops. Taro, yams, sweet potatoes, and my nominee for the champion state evading foodstuff, which is cassava or manioc or yucca. Cassava, you can plant cassava almost anywhere. It grows with almost no effort. It can easily be disguised. In Latin America, it's called the bread of war. Farina de guerra for guerrillas who plant manioc in the forest and in the jungle. You plant cassava, it gets ripe in about a year with very little tending, and here's the key thing. Although you can dig it up and eat it after 11 months or so, you can leave it in the ground for another 2 years, and it's perfectly good to eat. So if the state wants your cassava, it's going to have to dig it up tuber by tuber, just the way you do. And so it is an unconfiscatable crop, right? And if you've dug a lot of tubers, then they have a cart full of tubers. It's not worth a whole hell of a lot, and not worth confiscating in the first place. So that root crops are planted not just because they make sense in a certain area. They are planted because they are a state-resisting form of agriculture, agriculture of evasion, as I would call it. The same is true historically for maize. When maize came, but not quite in the same way. The Portuguese brought maize. It's a New World crop. In the 16th century, and it spread over Southeast Asia. Within 80 years, it could be found all over Southeast Asia. But where was it found? It was found in upland areas where you could no longer grow unirrigated rice. That is to say, maize would grow higher in the watershed by another 1,000 or 1,500 feet. So it gave people another 1,500 feet of running room, if you like, up the watershed away from states after they could no longer plant rice. So maize became an escape crop for a while as well. The most important thing, of course, about hill cultivation is that it is slash and burn cultivation, shifting cultivation, or the old English word swidden cultivation, all designating the same thing, where you cut down the brush, you let it dry, you burn it, and then you plant crops among the sort of ashes, which provides a lot of the nitrogen for the crops. You grow crops there for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Meanwhile, you've prepared another area and slashed the growth there. If you have enough land, this is a completely sustainable ecological practice. The point for our purposes is that this kind of cultivation means that the fields move over time from one place to another. So if you want to have a cadastral survey and if you want to tax land, the fact is that the fields are fugitive. They're sort of fields that change, and the tax collector has to kind of find them. Not only that, the people who are planting these crops are themselves moving around with their fields, so you find it hard to catch up with them and to sort of pin them down. Not only that, an average Swidden field is actually growing maybe 20 or 30 different kinds of crops. So if the taxman comes, and they mature at different rates, so if the taxman comes, there may be 1 or 2 things that are mature, not worth their trouble if they find the field and if they find the people in the first place. So the point is that Swiddening is a form of agriculture from which it is almost impossible for the state to appropriate. And my argument is that where you have perennial water, people can, under safe conditions, grow wet rice, and they do. But the reason why they plant root crops and the reason why they Swidden is because it's a form of agriculture that keeps them out of the clutches of the state. And it is, if you like, a form of subsistence that is politically chosen for its advantages in state evasion. They have a social structure also that allows them to fission and split up hill peoples. And Ernest Gellner, in the context of Morocco, says that it's as if the Berbers have a proverb that goes, "Divide that ye be not governed." That is the opposite of the Roman divide and rule. Because they realize that if you split into these minimal segmentary lineages, it's impossible for the state to catch up with you. And whenever they're pressed by the state, they fission into sort of little groups and disappear. The same thing is true for Southeast Asia. I have an argument that I'm not going to go into right now that at least raises the possibility, with very little evidence, that all of the hill peoples in Southeast Asia, almost without exception, have a story about how they once had the book, they once had writing, and they lost it. They lost it either because it was stolen from them, because they were cheated of it, or because they were careless and The cow ate it, or a whole series of stories. But it like 90% of the groups in the hills have the story of we once had writing and it was taken from us or we lost it. It's so common that I found myself wondering, well, many of these peoples we know were in lowland areas where it was common for there to be a literate minority. Why don't we take these folk tales seriously? Why isn't it possible that these groups may not have over time left writing and texts behind? The problem with texts is that once they're written, they're kind of permanent if they're kept, and you can actually measure heterodoxy from a given text that stays put. Whereas if you just have an oral tradition, the oral tradition can move subtly with things dropped out and things added over time, but remains the traditional story, and it's more plastic. So if you're a weak and moving people, you may find it advantageous to adjust your story about your history to make a connection with a particular kingdom that you want to make a connection with. And so at least I want to entertain the possibility that the abandonment of written literary texts and the reversion to oral traditions may not also be a strategic move by people in the hills over long periods of time that made it possible for them to advantageously reinvent themselves and their history in order to avoid problems and to position themselves more successfully. And many of these people actually refused to have a history at all. They ask them, where do you come from? Where were your people once upon a time? And they'll say, oh, we don't know. Nobody knows that. So there are people in the hills who, in a sense, refuse to have a history. And it strikes me that when we think of these people as a people without history, it may be that they have just as much history as they want. And maybe under certain conditions, they don't want to have a history, and they find that advantageous. So all of the things, what's interesting to me in the final analysis is that all of the things that you might imagine these people do in order to remain out of the clutches of the state, their physical dispersal, their simplified social organization, the fact that they have no permanent rulers, their practice of shifting cultivation, their reliance on oral traditions, the fact that they live in remote, inaccessible places, the fact that their religious practices are always different from the religious practices of the people in the valley. These are all things that mark them out as barbarians to the people in the valley, but they are all things that are advantageous politically if you want to stay out of the clutches of the state. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jim, for such a provocative and very, very interesting critique of the mainstream narrative of progress of the nation-state, and also of the idea that people who are outside the state are primitive or are really a stage in the evolutionary scale of progress. I think we have so much to think of, and would like to open the floor for questions. And Carl, how do you want us to operate?
Just raise a hand and I'll pass you a mic.
Thank you, sir. That's simple. Okay, I'll try to be even. So we'll give a question to this section and a question to this section and the other way around. Okay, the floor is yours now. Brian, want to start first? He's always quick, huh?
I'm talking right into my own ear. I don't really want to start first. I hate it when professors go first. If any students have a burning question. No? Okay. The students don't like to go first either. So, super fascinating stuff. I have a lot of questions about it. But I wanted to offer just sort of an alternative interpretation of the last point you made about the book and see what you thought of it. Obviously there's there's good things and bad things about living under a state regime. I know we all hate it, especially in April, but, certain benefits, for example, are that somebody's willing to extract resources from one group and spend it, for example, teaching kids to read, right? So we all probably were educated by the state, and the students here are kind of trying to finish that off as best they can. And it seems to me that if you're part of a culture that decided, okay, the costs of living in a state are bad enough that we're going to flee, we're giving up some of the benefits of the state, and maybe reading of all the benefits of living in a state is the one you would be most nostalgic for, because it's so life-changing to learn to read, to learn to develop your mind in that way, and that sort of thing. And that might explain why they all have this story about having the book. It's like you're giving something up, and giving up the experience of reading and getting lost in words is particularly profound in some way.
So two comments. It's a nice question and a crucial question. The first one is that it's important to remember that I'm dealing with early states. That is to say, it's not until, late 18th century at the very earliest that some states decide that part of their job is improving the physical health, education, welfare, and so on of their population. This is not something that occurred, right, to traditional states. So I'm dealing with states that are haven't gotten the idea that the popular welfare is part of what a state does. So it's pre-Westphalian state that I'm dealing with. So the improvement is not on its agenda. The second thing is what I want to do is, although I understand the point that you're making about texts and a literate tradition, I guess I'd want to have people listening to this exchange understand the incredible richness of oral traditions and the way in which it is possible for a community to keep incredibly elaborate stories on the model of the Odyssey and the Iliad, which were, after all, tales told by bards and singers, and to understand that orality is not just the absence of writing, but it is a different form of the codification of culture. It's taught by a kind of apprenticeship and so on. So I want to emphasize the way in which a kind of village that doesn't have literacy is a kind of encyclopedia of stories and history and practices and religious beliefs and beliefs about the spirits of the land that are every bit as encyclopedic as the things that might be written down. And in fact, most of the things written down in the early texts of states are in fact these oral traditions for the first time given a sort of written form. I think that the attraction of the state, and there were periods when there was population movement from the hills to the states, and the states were like a kind of magnet. And that happened particularly when trade and the advantages of trade and wealth were at their maximum. And you could get that wealth more effectively in the city. There was a religious hierarchy and a mercantile hierarchy that made it attractive. I think that it was not was attractive more for those reasons than the fact that it was a kind of literate culture with a sort of body of writings. Remember that there's this period in Greece from 1100 to 700 called the Greek Dark Ages, in which the Hittites perhaps invade, no one's quite sure, in which all of the kind of cities, more or less, there are no states, and the Greeks are literate in Linear B until 1100. Literacy disappears until 700, but it comes back in the Phoenician form, right, of the modern Greek alphabet. And so there are 400 years, this is the Iliad and the Odyssey period, in which there are no literate surviving texts from Greece. And you might also think of what happened with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, in which literacy in Roman script and Roman literacy more or less disappeared completely, except in a handful of monasteries and so on. So there are periods in Western history when literacy disappears or is confined to very small circumstances. And so I guess I want to make the case for the richness of orality as something worth paying attention to in its own way, that it is bears comparison anyway to literate texts. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Let's take a question from this side, so we'll be even and fair. If there is a question, yes, sir.
Here you go.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. So you were talking about the movement of people from the hills back and forth to the state, to the valleys. And you talked about the coercive actions of the state to keep people in. And we know that the state is sometimes coercive, but sometimes it provides security, or it gives people the illusion of security and gives them a lesser of two evils choice, that it might be better to remain here than to leave and take your chances in a less in not as a good situation. So I wondered, at some point the state might have used coercion in dealing with people in the hills, but they might have also used other tactics to lure them back, to draw them back. And I wondered if your research or you have some examples of that, if you could talk about that.
It's good. It's also a good question. I've actually tried to examine those, particularly for the Burmese and Thai states. Often you get the collapse of a dynasty, and there's a new dynasty that starts to build itself up, and it has very little population. So it needs to attract. It's like, if you like, it's a seller's market. And in order to attract settlers and the population that these early states need, they provide people with water buffalo, a kind of forgiveness for taxes for 5 years, no conscription. So there's a kind of honeymoon of population building in these early states. When they get large enough, however, they start to conscript. They become. They're also in danger of being raided from people in the hills. So there's a self-defense aspect to this. But the interesting thing, I mean, that is this depends on what you think of Sir Thomas Hobbes. That is to say, my understanding, and here I part ways radically with Steven Pinker and others, that the idea that life was nasty, brutish, and short, I think that it's only with the growth of states that you get the growth of large-scale warfare. Otherwise, in the pre-state, it's not that pre-state society is peaceful and happy and altruistic. There are lots of feuds and murders and so on, but weak groups simply move out of the way rather than court defeat, and the number of people mustered for a clash are actually quite small over time. So it's only valley. I mean, the thing that strikes me actually is that the valley states out-reproduce demographically the people outside the state. And yet, these states the early states are extremely unhealthy. We know this from the disease signatures that are left in the bones of if you find hunters and gatherer bones deposited at the same time, 20, 30 miles from people who lived in grain states, and you compare their skeletons, the bone signatures of nutritional deficits of the people in the state are absolutely striking. They have a much narrower diet. They have iron deficiency, particularly women who need it for ovulation. And yet, they have more children. They grow more rapidly than people outside the state. And the reason the state is so unhealthy is because most of our epidemic diseases come from domesticated animals right? The zoonotic diseases, all of our infectious diseases come between domestic animals and human beings, things moving back and forth. And these early states are the biggest concentration in historical, up till then, they're the biggest concentration of grain and animals and people in one sort of heap. And they bring together the lice, the rats, right? All of the parasites that like the grain and the animals and move back between us and the animals. And so it is, and that's why, of course, the Europeans had all these, they made their peace with all these parasites and had endemic diseases like measles and so on. And then when they came to the New World, they encountered a population that didn't have any of these crowding diseases, and it killed something like 85% of them. So it's really curious to me. So that's another reason why you might want to move out of an early state, right? And the modern Europe, it's not till the mid-19th century that the European city reproduces itself demographically. Up until then, it kills people so effectively that it grows only by sucking in more people from the countryside. And the only exception to this, as near as I can tell, are Chinese cities in which the night soil was systematically removed every day. And so you didn't get the sort of piles of feces and the consequences of that. But so even modern cities until the mid-19th century, when you got water and sewage and so on, modern cities were extremely unhealthy.
Owen?
So, I actually, sorry, I had my hand up before, so I have the mic here.
Oh, sorry.
I want to ask about, one thing I'm hearing is, and forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but I'm hearing almost a Darwinian theory of natural selection applied to state development and those who have mastered the art of not being governed. And you have a clustering of practices that give rise to successful state formation, early state formation anyways, and then a cluster of practices that seem to cohere among those groups that have successfully not been governed. And I'm wondering, so what we're missing is, they've died off, they've become extinct, those groups that have not been successful at not being governed. And then, of course, we have the record, and you've sort of walked us through some of that, of states that have not succeeded or not endured. And I'm just sort of curious about what your thought is on that idea. And then also, related to that, I guess, if, in fact, we do have a theory of, and I don't know if it's quite natural selection, but a theory of natural selection applied to state development and not being governed, what does that mean for, in the contemporary, particularly in the American context? We have a lot of this reaction to the overbearing state, and a lot of it is kind of, I think, fluff. It's not this kind of effort to escape that I think you're talking about. But I'm wondering if, in fact, we have a theory, these are a set of factors that cluster around not being governed. In a post-1945 world, is it possible for one to not be governed any longer?
To make the second question first, to make a long story short, I just recently published a little book, a light book, called Two Cheers for Anarchism. And it's, so I'm not an anarchist in the sense that, or I can think of some nice insights that anarchists have had that I think are really important. But do I imagine life without the state? I think our job is taming the state, even though I'm quite pessimistic about our success so far. But life outside the state is inconceivable. So the question of, it's interesting that you should put it in terms of natural selection. I do think of it as adaptation, which is another way of thinking about natural selection. So here's the way I've tried to think about this with respect to particular groups. So many of you have probably heard about the Hmong or the Miao, sort of a large group in Laos and Vietnam. Many of them were recruited by the CIA, a lot of them in the United States, California, Minnesota, and so on. So they were a very large group, and as near as we can tell in terms of their linguistic family, there were a lot of these peoples in the lower Yangtze Valley maybe 1,200 years ago. And this would have been an area where there was a certain amount of literacy. One imagines that there were, this was a period of the expansion of the Ming state. I'm sorry, the late Ming state, an early Qing state. And here's what I am able, I think, to reconstruct. You have this group that find themselves at the edge of a Han expansionist phase. And so their question, the question that's posed to them is whether to stay put and be absorbed by the Han state or whether to move away. Most of them probably stay where they are. And over time, they disappear as Hmong or Miao and become part of a sort of larger Han culture. And sort of Hanness is actually made up, confected of all of these fragments, if you like, over time that are absorbed by the Han. But some of them move away. And they remain Hmong or Miao and don't become Han. The Han state expands again, confronts them, and the choice is whether to stay put and be absorbed by Chinese magistrates and Han rule, or to move further away. And some of them stay, some of them move away, and so on. So the group that continues to move away then acquires a history of staying out of the clutches of the Han state, an identity that has to do with fleeing and a certain kind of adaptive agriculture that make them less, more immune to being taxed and controlled by the Han states. And they become the Miao or Hmong that has a kind of history of flight and resistance which they kind of treasure and which they then celebrate. So and they're the only, what I suppose I want to emphasize in response to your question is that most of the people who were historically Hmong have probably disappeared into the record as Han. And we only know the Hmong who kept moving and went into the hills. And so, by and large, most of these peoples have been absorbed over time. But we know, if you like, the runaways. And the same actually would be true for lots of Native American groups as well, I should add, right? Although there wasn't the reservation system that essentially segregated them in a kind of apartheid fashion.
Okay, I think Owen wants to have a question, and then we'll get to this section.
Very
I want to
good.
hear students also asking questions as
Good.
well.
You name for those who seek the hinterland, or those who seek the hinterland, who flee to the mountains or the desert,
Right.
or stay there, choose to stay there, and then honor their own culture and affirm it. You give negative vector reasons, essentially. Fleeing from taxation, fleeing from confiscation, fleeing from mass conscription to warfare. Do you find in your research evidence that there are positive evaluations that are at a different realm than social, that lie with a need for solitude and a need for less density in the way that they live, a preference for swing or slash agriculture, or for herding, as opposed to having the sedentary life? And if you find this, can you tell whether it's genuine, or is it just rhetoric?
No, not at all. There's a book on the so-called montagnards of Vietnam, and the title of the book is "Free in the Forest," and it happens to be a slogan that the montagnards use to describe themselves, and the idea that being dispersed and living independently in small groups and congregating often for only small parts of the year, the way lots of Native Americans did, right? Depending on whether they were spreading out for certain hunting activities and then congregating in the winter. I think that there is a celebration of that social structure and that kind of autonomy and freedom that one finds in the hills that is given a positive valuation. And if you needed a proof of that, whenever these people were forcibly resettled and put into camps, many of them died not just because of the diseases associated with concentration, but because of a kind of cultural malaise that this was a kind of destruction of their life, and they died, if I'm not exaggerating too much, of a kind of cultural heartbreak, that there was nothing to live for. I've seen this in, there's a book called A Poison Stronger Than Love about the Ojibwa in part of Ontario who were all forcibly resettled, and it comes across extreme. They all had to move from the river which they lived along, and they were concentrated, and they just collapsed as a people into alcoholism and so on. So yes, I think there's a you get a little bit of that, I suppose, in Appalachia. I think of Zomia as a transnational Appalachia in some ways. And if you wanted to see differences in culture and politics, all the Republicans in the Confederacy were at high altitudes. That is to say, this is called by C. Van Woodward the Scotch-Irish conspiracy theory, that the Scotch-Irish were poor in the hills and had no slaves. Although they were no friends of blacks, they weren't going to die for lowland slave plantation owners, and so they deserted in huge numbers. And if you look at, we know from the census of 1860, we know more or less who deserted, because the census was conducted in consecutive numbers by the census taker, and the desertion occurs at almost exclusively high altitudes. These are the people who leave the Confederacy. And they go back to the mountains, and they take their arms with them, and they're not going to be reconscripted. They violently resist reconscription. So there's a kind of interesting history, not to mention of lawlessness of marijuana and distilling and so on as a non-state space in Appalachia. That would be interesting to pursue. I can't resist. I haven't done anything on this, but I believe that there is a zomia of flora and fauna as well. That is, bears in the New World were lowland savanna creatures. The only reason why they're in the mountains now is because they were killed out and driven into the hills. The same for the last of the timber wolves and so on. And if you want to find Native American flora that existed before the Europeans came, the best place to go is in these refugia in the hills and places that have not been touched by European agriculture and so on, and you can find a much greater percentage of Native American flora and fauna. But you have to go to these kind of regions of refuge, if you like, these what botanists call refugium, I think.
Okay, let's see if any more questions from this section. Hopefully from students or from this section, if this section gives up its right to ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, your lecture was very interesting, thank you. My question was, have there ever been instances in which the Hill people have been more technologically advanced than their Valley counterparts? Because there's no law saying that the Hill people happen to be farmers or hunter-gatherers. They can be scientists or businessmen, entrepreneurs, philosophers. So in this Hill people environment where they enjoy a more free state, because there is no state, there is no government regulation, and they also enjoy a more healthy environment because of their low numbers, so they're less susceptible to disease. So in this more politically free state, free society that they live in, have they been more susceptible to discoveries or innovations rather than their Valley counterparts that are tied down by government regulation? And if so, this would give reason to the argument that liberalism as an economic system works due to its lack of government.
It's a great question. So the argument is there's a book I once read called Marginal Europe, and its argument is that the people, the poor mountain people of Europe, the Swiss would be a good example, that they could not make a living. First, that is to say, they all had to become jacks of all trades. They had to do more than one thing because they couldn't support themselves with agriculture. There was a little agriculture, a little pastoralism, and they became, these were the people from the Auvergne in France, from Switzerland, who were artisans and spent part of their time out of the hills, right, practicing a trade. And the argument made in this book was that the people in the hills, because they had to have a larger portfolio of skills just to live in the hills, ended up having a whole series of valuable skills that were greater than those of, let's say, lowland agriculturalists who had enough land to farm and who just farmed, who didn't have any other skills. So the argument was that hill peoples have this, if you like, this set of mechanical skills. These were the people also who became very useful in early factories as well. So in the very earliest industry in North America and Europe depended on falling water. And so the early textile mills in New England are all up in the hills because these are the places that had the water wheels and the kind of water power that allowed you to have the early textile firms. But I think if you want to make a kind of fortune with your skills, you have to take them to the valley markets, right? That is to say, the hills tend not to have the kind of concentrations of economic power and resources in which you may develop these skills in the hills, but you can't cash them out, if you like, except in valley markets.
Okay. Any one last questions, because Professor Scott has to drive from Connecticut to Maine. So one last questions, if there is any. You don't have much time because I'm going to take it back if you don't. I want to thank all of. Oh, Mike. Yes, I'm sorry.
So you're talking about the sort of centralization and encouraging of people to grow manageable crops that states undertake, for instance, wet rice cultivation. And then also in your newer book, you talk a little bit about German scientific forestry and these sort of ways in which states encourage management and organization of landscapes, so as to be able to collect revenues from them more efficiently.
Right.
And I was wondering if you feel like, and when I was reading this, I was thinking that this seems like sort of a precursor to biopower in the sort of Foucauldian sense that then occurs later, maybe after 1945, in late capitalist states. Could you speak to that at all, maybe?
So one of the relationships between my book, Seeing Like a State, and what I've talked about today is that you could see in wet rice agriculture a way of making population and grain resources legible to the state so that it could be easily organized, appropriated, and controlled and surveilled. And I've elsewhere been interested, as you may know from Seeing Like a State, in the history of personal identifications, in the history of last names, and the creation of identities. And nobody in the world had permanent patronyms, that is to say, permanent last names passed on in the father's line that we associate with most Western countries, Iceland accepted, until courts and legal systems and states insisted that they have a stable legal identity. It was for taxes and tithes and conscription and so on that this system of last names was invented. And now, of course, we have social security numbers and fingerprints and I suppose DNA chips and so on, in which they won't even need our they won't even need they'll need just a sort of little fragment of our physical remains 8,000 years from now, and they can identify us completely on the basis of our distinctive genome in terms of a DNA identity. So it seems to me that one of the interesting things about the modern state is its capacity, its incredibly expanding capacity to identify particular people, particular statistical patterns, and so on. And much of this, if you like, effort to make legible minute aspects of the society is done for perfectly well-meaning purposes of delivering welfare benefits, and so on. I mean, if you want to identify all the people in the population who are missing their left leg in order to deliver prosthetic devices to them, then you need a tremendous amount of kind of information in order to be able to deliver these services. So the point is that this kind of knowledge about the underlying population, its characteristics, and the sort of rates of this or that, of illiteracy and so on, are all related to the capacity to intervene in the society. And this capacity to intervene is, if you like, neutral, in the sense that it can be for good or for ill, and we can debate different intrusions and whether they're for good or for ill. But the more you want to intervene in a minute way in the society, the more information you have to have about that society.
I think at this point, maybe we should end this wonderful conversation. And on behalf of the students and the faculty, I would like to thank you for a very, very provocative talk.